They sold my land while I was overseas. When I came back from deployment, the house I had poured my savings into stood the same, but the yard that wrapped around it, the garden my late mother had planted, the side lot where my little brother and I once played catch, was gone. A for sale sign leaned half buried in the dirt, and a stranger's truck sat parked where my oak tree used to shade the grass. I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a survey line had shifted, or maybe the county records were wrong. But no, the papers taped to my door told a different story. According to my homeowners association, I had forfeited the parcel when I failed to maintain dues compliance during my service overseas. They claimed they had auctioned the land to recover community costs. They called it a lien. They called it legal. They called it final. I called it theft. Neighbors stared as I stood in uniform on my own driveway, clutching notices that read like a foreign language. Unauthorized sale, foreclosure right, irrevocable transfer. I had left to serve my country, and I had returned to find that the very community I trusted had carved away part of my home. That was the morning my fight began. A battle not on foreign soil, but in courtrooms, board meetings, and the pages of law. And I swore they would regret underestimating me. I bought the house on Cedar Ridge Lane 3 years before my deployment. It wasn't much by city standards, a single-story brick place with peeling shutters and an uneven driveway, but it was mine. The house sat on a double lot, and that second patch of land was the real jewel. It wasn't just extra yard, it was history. My parents had once tried to buy that adjoining lot when I was a kid, but they never had the money. Years later, when I closed on it with my VA loan, I felt like I was carrying their dream forward. The space stretched wide, open enough for a garden, a small fire pit, maybe even a future garage. But more than that, it gave me peace. After long drills, I would sit under the oak tree at the edge of that lot and remind myself what I was working toward. Stability, roots, something no one could take away. At least that's what I thought. When I received deployment orders, I did everything by the book. I set up auto pay for my HOA dues. I gave them my forwarding address. I even let the management company know I'd be out of state. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, an older vet himself, promised to keep an eye on the place. I had no reason to worry. But HOAs are predators of silence. When you aren't there to bark back, they bare their teeth. At first it was small things, a letter about my unmowed grass, though Mr. Henderson swore he cut it himself every other week. A warning about unauthorized structures because I had left a shed behind the house. Then a notice claiming my lot was vacant and therefore required special upkeep fees. I didn't even see those letters until I returned. They had stacked up, unopened, like threats aging in the dark. According to their timeline, while I was halfway across the world sweating in desert heat, they began filing liens. They claimed I had missed 3 months of dues, though my bank records proved otherwise. They tacked on fines for neglect, then doubled them when they weren't paid immediately. With each notice, the balance grew until it looked monstrous on paper. Thousands of dollars for problems that didn't exist. And when the numbers reached a point they thought I couldn't fight, they took the nuclear option. The board declared my side lot delinquent property. They filed paperwork with the county clerk, held what they called a quiet auction, and transferred the deed to a developer's LLC for a fraction of its value. All of this happened in the span of 8 months. 8 months when I was patrolling foreign streets, trusting my home was safe. The papers on my door were the final insult. They didn't even have the decency to call me. They taped the notice like they were advertising a lost dog. In bold letters it read, "Parcel transferred, HOA authorization." I walked the property line in shock. My oak tree was gone, cut down to make space for a driveway extension. Fresh gravel crunched beneath the stranger's truck. A plastic playset sat in what had been my mother's rose bed. Every inch of it screamed that someone else now claimed what was mine. I knocked on the door of the man who had bought it. He was polite but firm. He showed me his deed, stamped, recorded, notarized. He said he had bought it fair and square through the HOA auction. He told me to take it up with them. That night I sat at my kitchen table with the document spread out in front of me. My uniform was still in the corner from the morning, my boots still dusty. My hands shook, but not from fatigue. It was fury. I had faced danger overseas, but this was betrayal at home. They thought deployment made me weak, too far to notice, too tired to fight. They thought I would roll over, but I had fought longer battles in harsher deserts, and I knew one thing for sure. If they could twist paperwork to take my land, then I would twist paperwork back to take it all from them. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office with the notice clutched in my hand. The building itself was nothing more than a rented suite in a strip mall, wedged between a nail salon and a dry cleaner, but inside it smelled like power. laminated rules on the wall, clipboards stacked behind the counter, a receptionist who barely looked up as I entered, her nails clicking across her keyboard like a metronome of indifference. "I'm here about my property," I said, voice low but steady. "Cedar Ridge Lane, Lot 17B. She asked my name, then tapped a few keys. Her expression shifted, just slightly, like she had seen this file before. "Oh," she said, "you'll need to speak to Mr. Grayson, our compliance officer. He's not in today." I didn't move. "Then call him. Tell him I'm here." She sighed, picked up the phone and dialed. After a hushed conversation, she handed me a clipboard with a complaint form. "He says you'll need to fill this out and wait for the next board meeting." I almost laughed. They had stolen my land, and they wanted me to fill out a form, but I took the clipboard anyway. My pen pressed so hard it nearly tore the paper. I wrote every detail: deployment orders, auto pay receipts, bank statements, the taped notice. When I handed it back, she smiled in that brittle way people do when they don't actually care. The board meeting came a week later. I walked into the clubhouse and felt every eye turn toward me. Some were sympathetic, others suspicious, but at the front sat 5 people who looked like judges in their own petty court. Linda Grayson, the president, folded her hands neatly on the table. She was a woman in her 50s, pearls tight around her neck, eyes sharp as glass. Beside her was her brother, the compliance officer, and 3 others who nodded at every word she spoke. It was clear she was the queen and they were her chorus. I stood, laid my deployment papers on the table, and demanded an explanation. "You knew I was overseas. You knew I paid my dues. You sold my land anyway. How do you justify that?" Linda didn't even blink. "The records show delinquency," she said calmly. "The board acted within its rights. The sale was lawful." "Lawful?" I snapped. "You forged a debt out of thin air. You stole from a soldier serving his country, and you have the nerve to sit here and call it lawful?" Her smile didn't move, but her eyes flashed. "Perhaps if you had taken better care of your property, Mr. Carter, none of this would have happened." The room erupted, neighbors muttering, some gasping. I felt my fists clench at my sides. They wanted me angry. They wanted me reckless. Instead, I leaned forward, voice low enough to slice through the noise. "You made one mistake," I said. "You thought I wouldn't fight back." That night, I called an old friend, a paralegal I'd served with years before. He didn't sugarcoat it. HOAs are tricky. They hide behind state statutes, corporate shields, and fine print. But if they sold your land without proper notice, or if their lien was invalid, you've got a case. You'll need records, board minutes, payment ledgers, filings with the county. Paper's their weapon. Paper will be yours, so I started digging. County clerk's office, dusty archives, hours of scrolling through microfiche. And that's when I found the first crack. The lien they claimed justified the sale had been filed 3 weeks after the supposed auction. In other words, they sold the land before they even had the legal paperwork in place. It wasn't proof enough to win yet, but it was blood in the water. When I confronted them with it in a second letter, their response was swift: a brand new fine. This time for unauthorized modifications. Claiming my shed didn't meet HOA standards. They sent the notice certified, as if to say, "We see you fighting and will bury you deeper." And I realized this was no accident. It wasn't negligence. It was war. The fines didn't stop. Within a month of my challenge letter, 3 more notices arrived. One accused me of parking violations because my truck had briefly sat on the street. Another claimed my grass was non-compliant in height. The third, the most absurd, demanded I repaint my shutters to match community standards. It was a strategy of exhaustion. They wanted me drowning in paper, too tired to fight the real battle, the stolen lot. One evening I walked out to find my mailbox door ripped clean off its hinges. A bright orange HOA violation notice was taped to the bent metal like a taunt. "Repair immediately." $50 fine. I knew this wasn't random vandalism. This was retaliation. I carried the broken door into the clubhouse at the next open session and slammed it down on the table in front of them. "You break it, then fine me for it?" I demanded. The room was packed, neighbors whispering in the back rows. Linda didn't flinch. She simply adjusted her pearl necklace and said, "If you cannot maintain your property, perhaps this community is not the right fit for you." That's when a voice rose from the back. Mrs. Henderson, my elderly neighbor, stood on shaky legs and shouted, "Shame on you! He was serving this country while you vultures stole from him." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, a ripple of anger. For the first time, the board's mask cracked. Linda slammed her gavel, barking for order, her composure faltering as whispers spread. "They sold his land while he was deployed?" That was the first time the community began to see me not as a rule breaker, but as a victim. Sympathy shifted, and the board knew it. 2 days later, I woke to find my water shut off. I rushed outside and saw the HOA maintenance truck pulling away from the curb. A bright tag fluttered on my meter. Service suspended for non-payment. My bills were up to date. The county water department confirmed it. The HOA had requested the shutoff, claiming unpaid utility surcharges. That was the moment fury hardened into resolve. They had gone too far. I called my paralegal friend, told him what happened. He laughed bitterly. Classic HOA playbook. Resource sabotage. Illegal as hell. Document it. I filed a complaint with the County Utility Commission. I also contacted a veterans legal aid group. When I told them the HOA had sold my land while I was deployed, they didn't hesitate. "We'll back you," they said. HOAs hate bad press, and stealing from a soldier, that's the worst press imaginable. Within a week, a pro bono attorney named Ms. Daniels joined my side. She was sharp, fearless, and relentless. "First, we stop the bleeding," she said. "We'll get your water restored immediately. Then we build the case." True to her word, she marched into the utility office with my deployment orders in one hand and state statute in the other. By evening, my water flowed again. The HOA tried to shrug it off as a clerical error, but I knew better, and now I had proof of their retaliation. The next board meeting, Ms. Daniels came with me. She wore a plain suit, carried a leather folder, and sat silently at my side until Linda tried to dismiss my claims. That's when she leaned forward, her voice like a knife. "By the way, Mrs. Grayson," she said, "state law prohibits the sale of property tied to active duty service members without a federal court order. Did you obtain one before auctioning my client's land?" Silence. The board shifted uncomfortably. Brad, the compliance officer, shuffled papers. Linda's face flushed red. She muttered something about community discretion. Ms. Daniels smiled coldly. "Discretion doesn't override federal law. What you did could be considered a violation of the Service Members Civil Relief Act. That's not just civil liability. That's federal." The room froze. Neighbors' whispers rose again. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker in Linda's eyes. It wasn't victory. Not yet. But it was my first small hero win. A crack in the armor. A reminder to them that I wasn't alone and that I wasn't just fighting back. I was fighting smarter. If the board was rattled after Ms. Daniels' warning, they didn't show it for long. Fear gave way to anger, and anger turned into a new barrage of attacks. Within weeks, I received a certified letter stamped with bold black ink. Foreclosure proceedings initiated. The HOA was claiming that my entire home, not just the stolen lot, was now subject to seizure because of continued delinquency and hostile conduct. I felt the air leave my lungs when I read it. They were trying to take everything. Ms. Daniels remained calm. "It's intimidation," she said. "They're bluffing." "But a bluff this bold still needs an answer. We'll file for injunctive relief." I wanted to believe her calmness, but fear crept in. Every time I drove into the neighborhood, I saw whispers behind curtains. Some neighbors avoided eye contact altogether. Others offered quiet nods of support. The community was splitting in two, and I was the wedge. The board didn't stop at foreclosure threats. They launched a smear campaign. At the next meeting, Linda stood tall in her pearl necklace and announced to the room, "We regret that one of our residents has brought shame upon our community with his reckless defiance. The board has no choice but to protect our neighborhood values." Then she played dirty. She accused me of abandoning my property during deployment. She claimed I had left the lot derelict, lowering everyone's property values. Her words dripped with venom, crafted to humiliate me in front of my neighbors. And for a moment it worked. A few people muttered. Someone even said he should have just paid. But then Mr. Henderson, my old neighbor, stood up. His voice cracked but carried. "He was serving this country while you vultures stole his land. You should be ashamed of yourselves." The room split. Half clapped, half scowled. A shouting match erupted. Linda slammed her gavel so hard the handle cracked. The smear campaign backfired. Instead of isolating me, it exposed her cruelty, and the whispers around town grew louder. Days later, I came home to find my fence gate torn clean off its hinges, lying in the grass like a corpse. My yard looked violated. My father's old tools, which I had kept in the shed, were gone. HOA patrol trucks had been circling the block earlier that day. I called the police, filed a report, but I knew how this game worked. The board would deny everything. Probably teenagers, they'd say. And yet a violation notice showed up the next day. Fence in disrepair. $200 fine. It was sabotage stacked on sabotage, but the board had made one mistake. They underestimated my attorney. Ms. Daniels began subpoenaing records, payment ledgers, auction notices, meeting minutes. She tore into their paperwork like a surgeon with a scalpel, and then she found something explosive. Buried in the meeting minutes from the month of my deployment was a single line item. Motion approved to sell Lot 17B to Cedar Ridge Development LLC. Purchaser related to board treasurer. The purchaser was Linda's cousin. When Ms. Daniels showed me the document, I felt rage and relief crash together. It wasn't just negligence, it was self-dealing. They hadn't just taken my land, they had sold it to family. We filed a motion accusing the board of fraud and conflict of interest. The judge granted an emergency hearing. Word spread fast. Neighbors whispered in grocery aisles. Some came to my door with casseroles, apologies, quiet offers of support. Others hissed that I was ruining the neighborhood. The HOA responded with its biggest strike yet. They froze my community privileges. I was banned from the pool, the clubhouse, even the holiday festival I had attended every year. A red letter notice arrived declaring me temporarily suspended from all amenities for hostile litigation conduct. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it was pathetic. They were bleeding power, and every petty move showed it. But I didn't have time to dwell on their antics. Court was coming, and in that sterile room of law and order, everything they had hidden behind closed doors would finally be dragged into the light. The emergency hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I arrived in uniform, not out of vanity, but out of principle. I wanted the court, and the board, to see exactly where I had been when they sold my land. The HOA showed up with their attorney, a man in a slick gray suit who carried himself like he had already won. Beside him sat Linda and the treasurer, the same cousin tied to the shady land sale. They didn't look nervous. They looked annoyed, as if all of this was an inconvenience. Judge Whitaker presided, a no-nonsense man with steel-rimmed glasses and a reputation for cutting through theatrics. He flipped through the filings quickly, then looked over his glasses at the HOA attorney. "Counsel," he said, "did your client sell this man's property while he was on active military duty?" The attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, the association acted within its rights under the governing documents. The homeowner failed to maintain compliance and—" The judge cut him off. "That's not what I asked. Did they sell it while he was deployed?" Silence. Then reluctantly, "Yes, Your Honor." That was the first crack. Ms. Daniels stood, her voice steady. "Your Honor, under the Service Member Civil Relief Act, no foreclosure, lien, or property sale can occur against an active duty service member without a court order. My client was overseas. The HOA never sought such an order. This sale is not just voidable, it is unlawful." The judge leaned back, expression hardening. "Is that true?" he asked the HOA attorney. The man fumbled. The board believed their corporate authority was sufficient. That's when Ms. Daniels dropped the bomb. She handed the judge the meeting minutes we had unearthed. And if unlawful sale wasn't enough, Your Honor, the purchaser of the property was the treasurer's cousin. A direct conflict of interest. They didn't just break federal law, they used it to enrich themselves. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even the clerk raised her eyebrows. The judge's gavel came down sharp. "I want the full HOA financial records from the last 3 years delivered to this court within 10 days. All ledgers, minutes, and contracts. Failure to comply will result in contempt." The HOA attorney sputtered, but the order was clear. When we walked out into the hallway, neighbors who had come to watch crowded around. Some clapped me on the back. Others whispered, "We had no idea." For the first time, I wasn't alone in the fight. And then came the twist I hadn't expected. That evening, I found an envelope shoved under my front door. No name, no return address. Inside were photocopies of emails between board members. The subject lines alone were damning. Fast Track Carter's lot sale. Don't let deployment delay this. Family deal priority. One email from Linda herself read, "He won't be back until spring. We can resolve this before he even notices." My stomach churned. It was proof of intent. Proof that they hadn't just stumbled into wrongdoing. They had planned it. Ms. Daniels nearly grinned when she saw the papers. "This," she said, "is the smoking gun." But who had sent them? The answer came at the next board meeting. Brad, the compliance officer and Linda's own brother, stood up before the room. His hands shook as he spoke. "I can't do this anymore. They forged fines. They pushed sales to friends and family. I warned them, but they told me to keep quiet. So I sent the emails. Do what you will." The room exploded. Shouts, gasps, some neighbors even cheering. Linda's face turned crimson as she screamed at him, calling him a traitor. But the damage was done. Her own family had turned witness. From that night forward, the tide shifted. Neighbors rallied. Veterans groups reached out with support. Local news picked up the story. HOA sells soldiers land while deployed. Cameras rolled outside the courthouse, microphones shoved toward me. I didn't seek the spotlight, but I didn't shy away either. The truth had to be told. And the board? They scrambled like rats on a sinking ship. The final hearing felt less like a routine court date and more like a trial everyone in the county wanted to witness. The gallery was packed. Neighbors, reporters, even veterans from surrounding towns who had heard the story. The HOA had tried to keep things quiet, but the whispers had turned into headlines, and now every eye was on them. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Miss Daniels beside me. She wore the same calm expression she always did, the kind that unnerved opponents because it meant she knew something they didn't. Across the aisle sat Linda, her cousin the treasurer, and their attorney. They looked polished, but their shoulders were tight. Even pearls can't hide fear. Judge Whitaker entered, stern as ever. He shuffled through the thick stack of filings, then peered over his glasses. "This matter," he said, "concerns the alleged unlawful sale of property belonging to Mr. Carter while he was on active military duty. Counsel, you may proceed." The HOA attorney went first. He spoke of bylaws, corporate authority, and the need to maintain community standards. He painted me as a neglectful homeowner who had abandoned his property and forced the board to act. His words were smooth, but there was no conviction behind them. The cracks were already visible. Then Ms. Daniels stood. She didn't bother with theatrics. She placed a binder on the podium, opened it, and began reading. "Email, dated May 14th. He won't be back until spring. We can resolve this before he even notices." She paused, letting the words hang heavy in the air. "Minutes from June. Motion approved to sell Lot 17B to Cedar Ridge Development LLC. Purchaser related to board treasurer." Another pause. Lien filing. Dated 3 weeks after the supposed auction. She looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the board did not act to preserve community standards. They acted to enrich themselves. They violated the Service Members Civil Relief Act, state nonprofit law, and their own governing documents. They stripped my client of his property while he was serving his country. That is not just unlawful, it is unconscionable," the gallery murmured, the weight of her words settling like stone. The judge leaned forward. "Counsel for the defense, do you deny these documents?" The HOA attorney shifted uncomfortably. "We dispute their interpretation, Your Honor." That's when Miss Daniels delivered the final strike. She called Brad, the compliance officer, as a witness. He walked to the stand with shoulders slumped but eyes clear. He raised his hand, swore the oath, and began. "I handled the violation letters. I told them Mr. Carter was deployed. I told them federal law protected him. They told me to do it anyway. They said he wouldn't fight back. When I objected, they threatened to remove me from the board." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Miss Daniels asked gently, "And who specifically told you this?" Brad swallowed hard. "Linda, my own sister." The courtroom erupted. Whispers, mutters, reporters scribbling furiously. Linda slammed her hands on the table, shouting, "Lies! He's bitter. He's jealous. Order!" Judge Whitaker's gavel cracked like thunder. Silence fell again. Brad's testimony continued. He confirmed the board had funneled properties to relatives, inflated fines, and even tampered with records. He admitted he had leaked the emails because he couldn't watch it continue. When he stepped down, the damage was irreversible. The judge turned to the HOA attorney, voice cold as steel. "Your clients have abused their authority, violated federal law, and engaged in self-dealing. The sale of Lot 17B is hereby declared void ab initio. Null from the start. Title shall be restored immediately to Mr. Carter. Furthermore, this court orders a full independent audit of the association's finances. Cost to be borne by the defendants." Linda's face drained of color. The treasurer slumped in his chair, but the judge wasn't done. "Additionally, this court finds sufficient cause to refer this matter to the State Attorney General for investigation into potential fraud and misappropriation. Pending that, this board is enjoined from taking any further enforcement actions against Mr. Carter." For a moment I couldn't breathe. Then the words sank in. My land was mine again. The gallery erupted in applause, veterans saluting, neighbors cheering, reporters shouting questions. I stood slowly, heart pounding, and looked at Linda. Her glare could have cut glass, but it didn't matter anymore. The law had spoken. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones crowded in. One reporter asked, "How does it feel to win?" I looked straight into the lens, my voice steady. "Feels like justice." This wasn't just about me. It was about every homeowner who's been bullied by people who think power gives them the right to steal. Today proves they're wrong. For the first time since returning from deployment, I felt whole. The weeks that followed felt like waking from a long nightmare. The county clerk officially restored the deed to my name, stamped and sealed with finality. I walked the lot again, tracing the property lines with my boots. The oak tree was gone, the place had hauled away, but the soil was still mine. I stood there in the quiet and promised myself I would rebuild. The HOA, meanwhile, was in shambles. The audit uncovered what everyone suspected: years of shady deals, bogus fines, and personal gain disguised as community improvement. The treasurer resigned in disgrace. Linda clung to her title until the recall vote arrived. That night, the neighborhood gathered in the clubhouse, and the ballot spoke louder than her gavel ever had. By a landslide, she was removed. For the first time in years, residents smiled at one another during meetings. The new board promised transparency, posting ledgers online, inviting volunteers, holding votes in the open. Some wounds would take time to heal, but change had finally come. Neighbors I had barely spoken to before knocked on my door with casseroles, tools, and seedlings for the lot. "For your garden," Mrs. Henderson said softly, pressing a pot of roses into my hands. "For your mother." I started rebuilding with their help. One fence post at a time, one bed of flowers at a time. Every nail driven was a reminder that they had tried to erase me and failed. Sometimes at dusk, I'd sit in a folding chair on the lot, watching the sun dip low and feel something I hadn't felt in months: peace. They thought deployment made me weak. They thought paperwork was stronger than principle, but in the end, the truth had weight. And when it finally landed, it crushed them. In the end, I learned that battles aren't always fought on distant soil. Sometimes the hardest ones happen in your own backyard, against people who hide behind clipboards and bylaws. The HOA thought they had power, but real power is in the law, and in standing up when others try to break you down. The moral is simple: never assume silence means surrender. Even when you're far from home, your rights don't disappear. And when bullies push too hard, they often dig their own graves with the very paperwork they thought would bury you. I reclaimed my land, but more than that, I reclaimed my voice. And when neighbors saw the truth, they rallied too. Justice didn't just restore my property, it restored our community. Now I want to hear from you. If this happened to you, if your HOA sold off your land while you were away, would you fight tooth and nail, or would you pay just to make the nightmare stop? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you think this story was intense, wait until you hear the next one: how an HOA tried to evict a widow for keeping her late husband's flagpole, only to discover the flag itself held the clause that brought them down. Don't miss it. Subscribe now, hit the bell icon, and join us next time for another showdown where justice finally gets the last word.